I felt like God had been so kind and so gracious and so patient with me. Just 5 years in,
Mhm.
I had to tell people what God had done.
At the point where you are right now, Rachel, you have a very different perspective
Mhm.
than you had 26 years ago when you
Yeah,
began your homeschool journey.
yeah,
And, as I was thinking about this topic, and I was thinking about this morning as we were preparing for this, I was thinking about how, when you're a little kid, like for some reason, the image of being at my grandmother's house came to me. And I remember her house very vividly. I can
mm,
tell you where every room was. I can tell you pretty much every piece of her house, what her kitchen looked like, what her
yeah.
living room looked like,
Oh,
what the front of the house looked like. I remember my grandfather standing in his front yard watering his lawn with a hose every single
wow.
day.
Yeah.
And in my little mind, their house was huge. Like
Oh,
it
yeah.
was massive.
Mhm.
And we went back several years ago. I didn't get to go inside because someone else was living there. But we went back several years ago and we drove by the house. And I remember just sitting in the car and I was like, it's so small. Like it's so much smaller
Mhm.
than I thought it was as a child.
Yeah,
And for some reason that really hit me like, wow, it's all about perspective though, right? When
yeah,
we
it
start
is.
something and when we're little, you know how when you are for some reason, I used to do this when I was laying in bed. I would lay in my bed and I would measure the door like with my fingers in front
Yeah,
of my face. And I was like, oh, the door's only this big and it's like a
yeah,
half an inch,
yeah,
because from your point of view and your perspective, it's just a little teeny tiny door. But then you
yeah,
go walk through the door and it's a completely different size. And so
exactly.
perspective really is everything. And it's not just in the things that we see, but
Right.
it's in the things that we do, like
Mhm.
homeschooling. And
Yeah.
so I would love for you, Rachel, to just share with us. I want you to just kind of start by sharing with us, like, when you started homeschooling 26 years ago, what was your perspective then? And how has it changed now that you're at the end of that journey? And we're going to talk about this week
Mhm.
because I think that we need to have the right perspective, which of course is a biblical perspective.
Right.
But share with us how that has changed in your life.
Yeah, so when the circumstances of life presented homeschooling as really the only option. So I don't I won't retell the story here, but the circumstances were public school was not an option, private
Hmm.
school was not an option. Homeschooling was, the only thing that looked like we had to do something, right? I mean, he was supposed to be in kindergarten. We couldn't do nothing.
Right.
And so when that happened, it looked impossible.
Hmm.
I mean, that's the number one word. And it looked I told this story the first time I ever spoke at a homeschool conference. I don't know if I've told you this story before, but the first time I ever spoke at a homeschool conference, I literally nursed one of my children, handed her off to my husband, and walked down the aisle to a packed room of 500 women.
Wow.
And I was just sort of like, oh my goodness, what is this about?
Yeah.
Well, on the back row of that audience, right about the time I walked in, this group of veterans, like women who had been doing home education since creation, okay? They came in with their arms crossed and sat on the back row and just sat down and just sort of looked at me like this. So I've got all of these moms with their pens poised. Some of them were sitting in the floor on the stage, right? I mean, I've got 500 moms just like, what is she going to say? And
Yeah.
then I've got these 5 women on the back row. And I started out saying how, and I'm just trying to think, I had been homeschooling maybe 4 or 5 years at that point. So retrospectively, I think who was I to stand on a stage in front of 500 moms? And yet I felt like God had been so kind and so gracious and so patient with me. Just 5 years in,
Hmm.
I had to tell people what God had done. I mean, I just couldn't not tell people. But I stood up there and I said, I just have to tell you, when I started this, I felt like someone was slamming a penitentiary door behind me. I felt like I could hear it echo, like I was captive and I had walked into a prison and it was cold and it was musty and there was no escape. And those women on the back row, they talked to me after my presentation. And that was the number one thing they criticized was you can't say that. You can't tell people that. And I said, but we've got to meet them where they are. I mean, that's legitimately how I felt. And, right now in this moment, you're talking to me about, before we started recording, about all these new listeners you have. And, at Apologia, we've got all these new parents coming and they don't know, right? I mean, they're brand new and they're coming into this and they're feeling that, right?
Yep.
I mean, they're like, look, I never wanted to be here. I still don't want to be here. And I think there's something powerful about affirming those feelings. This is not zippity doo dah. This is not, I saved up everything to be here. This isn't, I've dreamed about this day. And there are people that's true for, and God bless them. But for a lot of people, and especially in this moment, there are a lot of people who are feeling forced to be here. Yep. And so I think it's valid to say, I get that. I get that. And so when we started, my perspective was at the bottom of a pit or in a prison, and somebody else had the keys. It just looked like, I can't do this. Oh, wait, I don't want to do this. Right. So I was completely overwhelmed. I felt very lonely. This was 1996. So I knew a few people, but it wasn't like I knew lots of people.
Right.
It was
not at all like it is today.
Oh, no. So my perspective was problems. This is that kid. This is the kid that is so hard to parent. And, apple didn't fall far from the tree. Got that from me, right? So I see problems. I see impossibilities. I feel overwhelmed. I feel empty and alone. And I think of all the things that I lost. So that was my perspective. So I don't see any ray of hope in there, right?
Homeschool Insights is sponsored by CTC Math. If you're looking for a great online math program, visit ctcmath.com and try it for free. For more great homeschool inspiration and resources, listen to the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday.